Right, so if you thought the biggest story coming out of the Nat-C conference, the National Conservatism Conference this week, was Suella Braverman setting out her leadership intentions to replace Rishi Sunak before the Tories have even lost the next general election, then you must have missed out on the admissions of one Jacob Rees-Mogg, the haunted pencil, a man who looks like a rejected Beano character thrown out for looking too flipping evil, fessing up to subverting democracy. This is a guy who loves to come across as an intellectual heavyweight, Mr. Clever Clogs. Mr. I've memorised the entirety of Hansard. It's so exhausting being so simply super. Let me have a kip on the Commons benches here for 5 minutes. Well, he's too clever by half, it seems. As he overlooked the fact he was on film making his speech, and he basically confessed to the voter ID laws being nothing to do with eliminating the already negligible amount of voter fraud out there, but rather about rigging elections in the Tories' favour. In his speech, he said, "From a Conservative point of view, it is a mixed picture. We are one nation state. There is no more prospect of the UK going back into the United Kingdom." He meant the EU. "And the gerrymandering effort you read about today of Keir Starmer giving the vote to all EU nationals here would not get us back into the European Union. It's fanciful to think that. It's a particularly silly scheme. I very much doubt they'll do it in the end. Parties that try to gerrymander end up finding that their clever scheme comes back to bite them, as dare I say, we found out by insisting on voter ID for elections, as people who didn't have ID were elderly, and by and large voted Conservative. So we made it hard for our own voters, and we upset a system that worked perfectly well. It was rather glorious of our country, actually, that we did it on an honesty basis, when the real problem is with postal voting. So don't get too fretful about random schemes thought up by the socialists, because gerrymandering doesn't really work." There's a lot to unpack there, really, isn't there? Apart from my posh voice. It was meant as a jab at Starmer's idea of giving the vote to EU nationals, which I covered in a video yesterday. Mogg of the assumption that this is a gerrymandering exercise being done entirely to suit the Labour Party, because that's how he thinks. And although that may well be true from Keir Starmer's intentions, he has announced he is a Tory after all. Giving EU nationals settled here the vote seems perfectly okay to me. It seems a fair thing to do. Starmer's selective of us now, as opposed to when he pledged this, means he's lied again, instead of just sticking with giving all EU nationals here the vote. But I'm not going to get into that again here. You can go and watch that video. But finish this one first, obviously. Mogg doesn't think the socialists will do it anyway, as he put it. Well, given there isn't any left on Labour's front bench anyway, and more are leaving the party daily because of Starmer, he ought to know that line makes no sense. But hey, it's the hard right of the Tory party he's talking to. Must be like looking at a sea of googly eyes as they swivel loony style in all directions. And of course, they'll lap such sentiment up. Mogg might be right. It might not happen. What Starmer says and does on any given day might well be different from the previous. Anyway, he elucidated. Yes, I'm getting cocky with my vocab. It's Mogg after all. I draw the line at Latin, though. Went on to explain that gerrymandering never works because it didn't for his own party. He literally said, word for word, parties that try to gerrymander end up finding that their clever scheme comes back to bite them, as dare I say, we found out by insisting on voter ID for elections, as people who didn't have ID were elderly, and by and large voted Conservative. So we made it hard for our own voters, and we upset a system that worked perfectly well, was rather glorious of our country, actually, that we did it on an honesty basis, when the real problem is with postal voting. So don't get too fretful about random schemes thought up by the socialists, because gerrymandering doesn't really work. You've got to realise that at the time this law was passed, Mogg was in the cabinet that held collective responsibility in supporting this, in drawing this up. He can wheedle now that he didn't really support it, that it's a bad idea in hindsight, but he did at the time because of collective responsibility. If he felt so strongly against it at that time, as he's inferring now, he could have resigned his post, but that would mean standing by principle, and Mogg's, like most Tory principles, are frankly open to the highest bidder, aren't they? If you don't like these principles, I have others, yada, yada, yada. He was leader of the House of Commons. And yet now in this National Conservatism conference speech, he's gone, ignore all the guff we said about clamping down on voter fraud. This was a blatant gerrymander. We thought it would put off younger voters who don't vote Tory from being able to vote, but instead it was pensioners who got denied the vote most of all. Whoops, that blew up in our faces, didn't it? The Tories said they were doing this in the name of democracy. Instead, Mogg admits it was to subvert democracy. It was about electoral safety, they said. Instead, it destabilised that. It was about ensuring there was no fraud when there wasn't any fraud to speak of anyway. Mogg admits that. He said, we upset a system that worked perfectly well, was rather glorious of our country, actually, that we did it on an honesty basis when the real problem was with postal voting. But if postal voting was such an issue, why was it left completely unaddressed then, Jakers? Well, most of the elderly people vote by post by any chance. If postal voting is such a fraudulent process, will you now be addressing that instead, Mogg? Hardly likely after they drove off so many voters with this wheeze, is it? At least he's been honest at this point, even if it is by accident. But being the bunch of crooks this Tory government is, honesty might have dropped them in deep doo-doo. A politician has accidentally told the truth, and it was a Tory at that. Well, naturally, there's been political fallout. Of course, there should be. Everybody's going to try and capitalise on it, aren't they? Labour's MP, Dawn Butler, one of the good ones still left in the party, stood up and put to the Deputy Speaker that the prospect has now been raised that the Tories may have misled the country about the intentions of their voter ID policy, which may instead have been for partisan gain, as she put it, off the back of Mogg's admission to the Nat-C conference. The new rules may have put off up to 2 million people from voting in the recent local elections, she went on, saying that the policy was sold as combating voter fraud, but actually the fraudulence may have been committed by the government themselves. Butler asked if she should report this to the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner and the police, where the Deputy Speaker fudged the answer to this. It seems obvious to me that it should be both. Am I wrong? Fraud has been committed. It's been admitted on film by a man who was in government when the law in question was drawn up. From start to end result, Mogg knows the truth. Stick a Bible in his hand. Committed Christian as he claims to be, he wouldn't dare lie or obfuscate then, surely. He's already confessed to be party to committing voter fraud himself, hasn't he? Get it on tape under caution. Who wants to see a photo of Mogg's mugshots then? I certainly do. I do agree with him on one aspect of what he said there, though, and that is that it is glorious that our electoral system worked before and that it was built on trust. And that is great. We know it works because the voter fraud committed previously was so small as to not make one iota of a difference. No one got prosecuted for it. There was about, I think, something like 13 alleged cases, none of which went anywhere. This was a solution in search of a problem. And as has been exposed, the problem they were solving wasn't the one they were telling us they were actually fixing. The Tories knew it worked, the system by which votes are counted. First past the post, that's another matter entirely. But the acts of votes being cast and votes being counted, there was nothing wrong with it, except as we now know, it didn't work in the Tories' favour. The serious part of all of this is that we cannot have a functioning fair democracy with the Tories in government. They need to go, and they need to be removed permanently by addressing the first past the post system, which has a tendency to keep putting them into power. Members of that government are not Democrats. Any of them who claim it going forwards can have this pointed out to them, can have Mogg's words turned on them as evidence that they aren't, because they tried to rig due electoral process in their own favour. Every member of that government should now be brought up on charges, and if the law somehow doesn't cover this, excuses them by virtue of them being parliamentarians some way, somehow, then again, democracy has failed. Perhaps they can buy their way out of trouble, get fined, and that can be the end of it. Little slap on the wrist. They can just ask, well, Nadim's a Howie about that, I suppose. He avoided jail over his alleged fraud, after all, whereas a former Labour MP got jailed over a similar issue. You can compare and contrast those stories if you stick with the channel. Like, share, and subscribe if you feel like it whilst you're at it, and watch this video here next to learn all about that. Cheers, folks.